Furious, I drove to confront my wife's lover at his house. When he turned pale and tried to close the door, I kicked it open. What I saw inside was a nightmare that made me knock him out and call the police in shock. It was the first crack in my seemingly perfect life, and it came on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday evening. Helena, my wife of 11 years, walked into our Prague apartment. Her cheeks were red from the cold, and the scent of her perfume filled the air. She gave me a quick kiss, but her eyes immediately went to her phone, which was buzzing in her coat pocket. I didn't think much of it at first. Helena worked as an event planner for the city's elite, which often meant unpredictable hours and demanding clients. She thrived in chaos, her energy contagious. But lately, that energy felt distant, as if a part of her existed in a world I wasn't allowed into. It was the little things that bothered me. The late-night showers, the whispered phone calls, the new lingerie I never saw her wear at home. I tried to convince myself I was just imagining things. After all, as an architect, my long hours also left little time for suspicion. Then came the bracelet. I found it while searching for parking receipts in the glove compartment of her car. It was a delicate gold chain with a small heart-shaped charm, nestled in a velvet box. My first thought was that it was a surprise for our upcoming anniversary, but when the day came and went, the bracelet never appeared. My heart sank. I tried to shake off the unease, but it only grew stronger. Helena's behavior didn't help. She started leaving for work earlier and returning later. Her phone, which had once been casually left on the counter, was now always in her hand or hidden away. One evening, as we watched a movie, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She grabbed it so quickly that I was startled. "Work," she muttered, her eyes flicking to mine before quickly looking back at the screen. But her hand trembled slightly, and her smile didn't reach her eyes. I couldn't ignore the signs any longer. Something was terribly wrong. The turning point came on a Thursday night. Helena was in the shower, and her phone was charging on the nightstand. I hesitated, torn between my conscience and growing suspicion. But when the screen lit up with a message preview, my heart stopped. "Miss you already, gorgeous. Friday can't come soon enough. Martin." I stared at the message, the words searing into my brain. Martin. The name was vaguely familiar. Helena had mentioned him once. He was a wealthy client who was planning a series of high-profile events. "He's exhausting," she had said with a laugh, but there was no frustration in this text, only intimacy. My hands shook as I placed the phone back on the nightstand. The shower turned off, and I quickly stepped out of the room, pretending to busy myself in the kitchen. When Helena appeared, her hair wrapped in a towel, I greeted her with forced casualness. She didn't seem to notice the tension in my voice. Over the next few days, I began piecing together the puzzle. Martin Sakura, a flashy entrepreneur with a love for expensive parties, was the kind of client who would demand Helena's attention. But the text suggested something far more personal than a professional relationship. I decided to follow her on Friday evening. Helena dressed impeccably, a sleek black dress, heels that accentuated her long legs, and a hint of red lipstick. "Client dinner," she said, avoiding my gaze as she kissed me goodbye. As soon as she left, I grabbed my car keys and followed her. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I trailed her through Prague's cobblestone streets, the city lights blurring in my peripheral vision. My focus was solely on the silver car ahead of me. She pulled into the driveway of a sprawling villa on the outskirts of the city. The house, all glass and steel, loomed against the night sky like a monument to excess. I parked at a safe distance and watched as she walked to the door. Martin greeted her with a grin, his hand lingering on her back as he led her inside. The betrayal hit me like a punch to the gut. I sat in my car for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing with anger and disbelief. Finally, I made a decision. This wasn't over. I needed answers, and I was going to get them, no matter what it took. The next evening, I found myself standing in front of Martin's villa. My heart raced as I pressed the doorbell, the chime echoing through the cold night air. My mind replayed 100 scenarios confronting him, demanding the truth, or simply unleashing the fury burning inside me. After a few tense moments, the door opened, Martin stood there, his sharp features lit by the glow from the house. He was dressed casually, a glass of wine in hand, but his expression changed the moment he saw me. His confident demeanor faltered, replaced by a flicker of fear. "Victor," he said, his voice strained. "What are you doing here?" "You know exactly why I'm here," I said, stepping closer. "Where's Helena?" Martin's hand tightened on the door frame. "She's not here," he said quickly, his voice rising slightly. "You're mistaken." "Mistaken?" I took another step forward, forcing him to backpedal. "I followed her here last night, Martin. Don't lie to me." He tried to shut the door, but I jammed my foot against it. My anger boiled over, and with a burst of strength, I shoved the door open and stepped inside. Martin stumbled back, his composure crumbling. "You need to leave," he said, his voice trembling. "You don't understand." "Then make me understand," I shot back. "Where is she?" His eyes darted to the hallway, betraying him. I followed his gaze and saw a door at the end, slightly ajar. Something about the way he panicked told me the answers I was looking for were behind that door. As I moved toward it, Martin lunged at me, grabbing my arm. "Don't go in there," he shouted. I shoved him off me, my adrenaline surging. "Stay out of my way," I growled, kicking the door open. The sight that greeted me was something I could never have prepared for. The door slammed against the wall, revealing a room shrouded in dim light and thick tension. The air smelled faintly of sweat and stale cologne. My heart raced as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. Helena sat in the corner, her arms tied behind her back and her mouth gagged. Tears streaked her face, her makeup smudged. Her dress, the one she had worn for client dinners, was wrinkled and torn at the hem. Her eyes widened when she saw me, a flicker of relief cutting through the terror. "Helena!" I rushed to her, my hands trembling as I tried to free the knots around her wrists. "What the hell is going on?" she whimpered through the gag, shaking her head frantically, as if trying to warn me. Before I could process her reaction, a shadow loomed behind me. Martin lunged at me, a heavy candlestick raised high. I spun around just in time to block the blow, the force reverberating through my arm. Adrenaline surged as we struggled. His face twisted in desperation. He was stronger than I expected, his movements wild and erratic. "You shouldn't have come here," he growled, his voice laced with panic. I managed to shove him off, grabbing the candlestick from his grip. My chest heaved as I stood over him, my mind clouded with anger and disbelief. "What did you do to her?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "She wanted this," he spat, crawling backward. "She came to me willingly." "Liar." Helena's muffled scream broke through my haze. Her voice roared with pain, reigniting my fury. Martin tried to make a run for it, but I swung the candlestick, knocking him to the ground. He crumpled, groaning in pain. I turned back to Helena, untying the ropes with a mix of urgency and rage. As the gag fell away, she gasped for air. "He was blackmailing me," she choked out, her voice hoarse. "He said he'd ruin my career, our lives, if I didn't come here." Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. The betrayal I had imagined was nothing compared to the reality. Martin wasn't just her lover. He was her tormentor, and now he lay unconscious on the floor of his own gilded cage. Helena clung to me as I dialed the police. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what had just unfolded. The operator's calm voice guided me through the steps, even as the rage in my chest threatened to overwhelm me. Officers arrived within minutes, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. Helena's statement poured out in fragments. Martin's threats, the coercion, the nights she spent trapped in his twisted games, the hidden cameras in the room, the photos he had taken without her consent, and a cache of incriminating messages that provided irrefutable evidence. Martin regained consciousness as the police secured the scene. His face was pale, his arrogance shattered, as the officers cuffed him. He sneered at me. "You think you've won?" he said. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." "No," I said coldly, stepping closer. "You have no idea who you've messed with." The officers led him away, and for the first time that night, the house felt quiet. Helena sat on the edge of the couch, her face buried in her hands. I knelt beside her, unsure of what to say. The woman I had thought had betrayed me was instead a victim, ensnared in a nightmare neither of us saw coming. In the days that followed, the truth about Martin spread like wildfire. His arrest made headlines, exposing not only his crimes against Helena but also a web of other victims who came forward with similar stories. He had used his wealth and influence to manipulate and exploit women, leaving a trail of shattered lives in his wake. Helena faced the fallout with quiet resilience. She resigned from her job, unwilling to face the whispers and stares of her colleagues. Therapy became a lifeline for her, a way to process the trauma and rebuild her sense of self. Our marriage, however, hung by a thread. One evening, as we sat on the balcony overlooking the city, she broke the silence. "Victor," she began, her voice trembling. "I know I failed you. I should have told you the truth from the beginning. I was so scared." I looked at her, the woman I had loved and doubted in equal measure. "You didn't fail me," I said after a long pause. "You were trapped. But trust takes time to rebuild." She nodded, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "I'll do whatever it takes." In the weeks that followed, we took small steps toward healing. But something had changed in me. The anger that once consumed me had transformed into a steely determination, not just to rebuild our lives, but to ensure that Martin faced every consequence of his actions. Months later, I stood outside Martin's villa. The property, once a symbol of his arrogance, now sat vacant. The grass had grown wild, and the polished windows were streaked with dust. His empire had crumbled, his assets seized, and his name dragged through the mud. Justice, it seemed, had been served, but revenge is a peculiar thing. It doesn't fill the void left by betrayal or erase the scars of pain. As I stared at the abandoned house, I realized that my victory wasn't in Martin's downfall. It was in reclaiming my life. Helena and I eventually parted ways, not out of bitterness, but because we both needed space to fully heal. She moved to a quiet town by the coast, dedicating her time to helping other survivors of coercion and abuse. I stayed in Prague, channeling my energy into my work and rediscovering the passion that had once defined me. One evening, I found myself walking along the Vltava River, the city lights shimmering on the water. The path felt like a distant echo, a chapter closed but not forgotten. I thought about Helena, about the love we shared and the trials we endured. And then, I let it all go, the way the river carries away fallen leaves. As the breeze rustled the trees, I whispered to myself, true justice isn't about revenge. It's about finding peace. With that, I turned and walked away, ready to embrace the next chapter of my life. Thank you for sharing your story with me. If this moved you, please give the video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to Lauren's Story. I've noticed many of you who enjoy these stories aren't subscribed yet. By subscribing, you're not just following a channel, you're becoming part of a community that values deep, meaningful storytelling. Let's continue exploring these heartfelt journeys together. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you won't miss our next story.